On December 24th, 1971, 17-year-old Juliane Koepcke boarded a plane she didn't feel entirely comfortable getting on, though she couldn't have explained why at the time. It wasn't fear, not exactly, just a quiet sense that something was slightly off, the kind of feeling people tend to ignore when everything around them says it's fine. The airport in Lima had been crowded for hours, every earlier flight completely booked, and her father was already waiting for them in Pucallpa. Her mother was determined to get home that night, and when LANSA Flight 508 showed open seats, it felt less like a choice and more like the only option left. Even standing near the aircraft, there were small details that stood out if you paid attention. The plane looked worn in a subtle way, not damaged or obviously unsafe, but used, like it had endured more than it should have over time. Juliane noticed it, her mother noticed it, but neither of them said anything. They boarded anyway, because most decisions like that don't feel important until later. The flight began quietly, almost forgettably. Passengers settled in, the engines smoothed into a steady rhythm, and the usual background noise of conversation faded into that familiar hum that fills a plane once it reaches altitude. Juliane sat by the window, as she always did, looking out over the endless stretch of rainforest below. It felt grounding to her, something she understood. She had grown up around it, listening to her parents talk about ecosystems and patterns, about how everything in nature followed rules if you knew how to look. The jungle made sense in a way the sky never did, and watching it from above gave her a strange sense of calm, at least for a while. The storm didn't arrive suddenly. It built slowly, almost subtly at first. The clouds thickened from soft white to layered gray, then darker still, forming dense formations that didn't drift apart, but instead stacked and closed in. The plane didn't turn away from them, didn't change course in any noticeable way. It simply kept going, deeper into the storm. The turbulence started as a light vibration beneath their feet, something easy to dismiss, but it grew steadily, becoming sharper, more uneven. Overhead compartments began to rattle, and the wings outside the window flexed in ways that made it harder not to notice. A few passengers laughed nervously at first, but the laughter faded quickly as the movement intensified. The first drop came without warning, violent enough to pull a collective scream from the cabin. That sudden, weightless sensation hit and lingered, just long enough to leave everyone unsettled. Juliane gripped the armrest, her body reacting before her thoughts could catch up. Her mother, though, remained still, watching, her focus sharp in a way that stood out against the panic building around them. Outside, lightning began to flash, at first distant, then closer, until each burst of light filled the cabin in harsh white flashes that froze expressions of fear for a split second before darkness returned. It became clear, without anyone needing to say it, that they were no longer flying near the storm. They were inside it. Then came a sound that didn't belong, something sharper than thunder, closer, like metal being torn apart. There was no time to process it before the lightning struck the plane. The flash was immediate, blinding, followed by a crack that seemed to come from within the aircraft itself. The right wing ignited almost instantly, flames stretching backward as the plane began to shudder violently. This wasn't turbulence anymore. It was something else entirely, something uncontrollable. The panic in the cabin escalated instantly, voices rising into full, unrestrained fear. In the middle of it, Juliane turned to her mother, and what she saw there stayed with her more than anything else. Her mother wasn't panicked. She wasn't confused. She looked certain. "This is it," she said, calmly, almost quietly, as if stating something that had already been decided. The plane began to break apart in pieces, not all at once, but fast enough that there was no clear moment to understand what was happening. The structure of the aircraft gave way under stress it couldn't withstand, sections tearing loose, the inside no longer feeling contained. Juliane was still strapped into her seat when her section separated from the rest of the plane. One moment she was inside the aircraft, surrounded by noise and chaos, and the next she was in open sky, still secured to her seat as it fell. The sensation of falling wasn't what most people imagine. There wasn't time for fear to fully form, no moment to think clearly about what was happening. It felt more like disorientation, like the brain couldn't process the speed or scale of it. The sky spun, The wind roared so loudly it erased every other sound, and the jungle below rushed upward in a way that didn't feel real. It didn't feel like approaching the ground. It felt like being pulled into something endless. Then, just as suddenly as it began, everything went black. When she regained consciousness, she was lying on the forest floor, still strapped into her seat. For several seconds, nothing made sense. The silence was the first thing she noticed, though it wasn't empty. It was dense, filled with the layered sounds of the jungle, constant and alive. Sunlight filtered down through the canopy in narrow beams, illuminating pieces of wreckage scattered around her. The pain came next, not all at once, but in waves. A broken collarbone, deep cuts, swelling that blurred her vision in one eye. She was injured, but she was alive. Her mother was not there. She called out, first quietly, then louder, her voice carrying into the forest without any response. There was no answer, no movement, nothing that suggested anyone else was nearby. At some point, the panic that should have followed began to fade, replaced by something quieter and more focused. Survival doesn't always feel dramatic. Sometimes it's just a series of small decisions. She remembered what her parents had taught her about the rainforest, the one rule that mattered more than anything else: find water and follow it. Water leads to people. She stood there for a moment before moving, letting her body adjust, letting the shock settle just enough for her to act. Then she began walking. The jungle resisted her at every step, the ground uneven, vines catching at her legs, insects crawling across her skin. The air was thick and humid, heavy in her lungs, and the sound never stopped, an endless background of movement and life. Time lost its structure almost immediately. Hours blended into each other, then days. Eventually, she found a small stream, shallow but moving, and she followed it. It became her guide, the one constant in an environment that offered no clear direction. As she moved, pieces of the truth revealed themselves in fragments. Luggage scattered across the forest floor, clothing caught in branches, sections of the plain spread far apart, and bodies. Not in one place, not part of a single crash site, but scattered, which meant something she hadn't fully understood until that moment. The plane hadn't crashed in one piece. It had disintegrated in the air. By the fourth day, exhaustion had taken hold, and by the sixth, it was overwhelming. She had no food, only water from the stream, and her injuries slowed her down with every step. But she kept moving because stopping meant staying, and staying meant not being found. At one point, she noticed movement in a wound on her arm. It had become infected, and maggots had begun to burrow inside. Instead of panicking, she observed, the way she had been taught, understanding that the jungle wasn't something you fought blindly. Later, when she found a small container of gasoline among the wreckage, she used it, pouring it over the wound to force them out. The pain was immediate and intense, but it worked. By the ninth day, she could barely walk. Her body was weakening, every step heavier than the last, her energy nearly gone. Then, through the constant noise of the jungle, she heard something that didn't belong. Voices. At first, they blended into everything else, easy to dismiss, but then they came again, clearer this time, unmistakably human. She followed them slowly, carefully, until she reached a clearing where a small hut stood near the river. 3 men were there, and when they saw her, there was no confusion in their reaction. They understood immediately what they were looking at. They helped her, gave her water, allowed her to rest, and the next day they brought her to safety. Out of 92 people on that flight, Juliane Koepcke was the only one who survived. People would later call it a miracle, luck, something impossible, but survival didn't feel like that from the inside. It felt quiet, uncertain, built on small decisions made one after another. And even years later, what stayed with her most wasn't the fall or the impact, but the moment before it, when everything went silent, and Juliane deep down knew that nothing would ever be the same again. If you liked this video, be sure to drop a like and subscribe with the bell notifications on for more stories like this one. We drop new stories every week.